The Africa Center, a place where Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Thabo Mbeki hung out in the bar, where Wole Soyinka lectured on African literature, where Alice Walker read from her novel, The Color Purple, where Jazzy B held Saturday club sessions that led to the formation of Soul to Soul, and not forgetting the Limpopo Club run by Wala Danga from Zimbabwe, which promoted African musicians and African music from all over Africa since the 70s until his last gig in 2003. Since it was opened by Kenneth Kaunda in 1964, the Africa Center in Covent Garden, London, it was a place for debate, discussion, music and dance. It is a building Tutu described as belonging to all who are Africans and all those who have a care for the interest of the continent and its people. Today, the Africa Center is a shadow of its former self and stands at a crossroads. On the other side is a proposal by the trustees to sell up and find a more suitable building. On the other is a £12 million scheme to breathe new life into 38 King Street. The Tanzanian-born Ghanaian architect David Adaje has designed a new interior, seen here for the first time, that he believes it could be its salvation. Hadil Ibrahim, the daughter of Mo Ibrahim, the Sudan-born mobile phone billionaire, spearheaded the campaign to save the center in its current building. She recalls visiting the building 4 years ago. I was amazed that this wonderful building, an asset for the community, was nearly derelict. The struggle to save the Africa Center continues. A meeting was held at Source between the Save the Africa Center campaign group and the Board of Trustees of the Africa Center. And this is how it went.
My own involvement was in the 70s when, young man, you may not believe it, and interested in Africa, wanted a space where I could go and get information about Africa. And there was a wonderful bookshop in the Africa Center, and that was what drew me to the Africa Center. And then arrived there from North London, where I lived, and there were all these people talking politics in the bar, and it was a wonderful place just to catch up on what was going on in Africa and to learn an enormous amount. And then I watched Chedo by Usman Semben because there were some film screenings, and I was startled by how rich and the African cinema was, and the great contrast with some of the stuff that we saw from Hollywood. And I became enchanted with the center, and over the years I've volunteered, I've participated and done various other things to help that center when I came of age. And I'm sure all of us here have our own stories, and it would be important when you comment to share some of those stories as well, and your passion for why you want to remain engaged with the future of this center, whether in the building or elsewhere. Please express that later on. But before I introduce the panel, I want to invite Nigel Watt, who was the third director of the center, just to say something on behalf, open the proceedings properly, but also to acknowledge the woman who had the vision, Margaret Feeney, who had the vision for the center and had done probably more than anybody else to have the center established, and she died recently. So, Nigel, would you come up and say a few words?
Well, I will start by saying just a little bit about Margaret Feeney, so we remember her life. I started coming to the Africa Center, I think, in 1967, if I'm right, about 3 years after it got actively going. And I used to come on and off quite often until that day when I ended up as director in 1984. And then I went even more often after that. But what was very noticeable to those of us who came in those days was the presence of Margaret. She was she wasn't the sort of director who'd sit in her office and direct. She would be there in all the activities that took place. She managed to be open and in good relations with the different levels of people that you have to deal with, the Africa Centre, diplomats, government officials, and the public, the different groups of the African community in London. And of course the African community in the 1960s was very, very different from today. And she saw the need for a place where Africans could come, where people could come and meet Africans, people who were interested in Africa could come together. And she had the energy and the vision. Of course, there were people who supported her. And it grew out, in fact, of a Catholic organisation called Sword of the Spirit, which later became Catholic Institute for International Relations. But she never made it a Catholic place. She made it into an open place where it could be, people didn't feel alienated in any way. I won't quote some of the many things which were organised on her watch. You've got this bit of paper in front of you, which is fairly full. There's one important event, I think, that maybe you were at, were you, the Manding Conference?
Yes.
Which was in about 72. And that was a really high peak of activity at the Africa Centre on an intellectual level and as well as on a sort of international level. And so the initial vision of getting the place going, and then the ability to keep it going and to make it popular, we have to thank Margaret Feeney. When I became director, she was still on the Management Council for a short time. She was getting old, but that was a long time ago, and she only died last week or so. So she has been amazingly long-lived. She went on to be mayor of the city of Bath in her old age. And anyway, a wonderful person, and we wouldn't all be here today, I think, if she hadn't done what she'd done and established the Africa Centre. So could we just, for a minute, silence perhaps, remember Margaret?
So there are lots of things to discuss tonight, but initially we wanted to just welcome Eric Galvin to talk about his experience of some of the governance issues that we are all facing as part of the Africa Centre, and to basically explore some ideas about, and then have a discussion with Kay Whiteman, who's the Deputy Chair of the Africa Centre, and Dele, who is part of the Save the Africa Centre campaign, about some of these issues. Eric is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, and they've been going through a 3-year process of how you renew a 250-year-old institution, and how, because of the unique nature of the Africa Centre, where there's a board, but there are all of us who feel we own it. I mean, it's a little bit like a country, and the board are there as governments, and we know how the problems we have with governments in Africa. What is the relationship between the board and this wider group of stakeholders? How can we, moving forward, get to a stage where there's consultation, there's feedback, and people feel that they're part of a process rather than feeling that they've been excluded?
My personal direct contact with the Africa Centre started 8 days ago. It was when Boko rang me up and said, we were introduced to one another through the RSA, and we had a long chat, and he invited me to come tonight. Over the last 10 to 15 years, I've probably been on about a dozen boards of one sort or another, some of them quite troubled and conflicted organisations. I am not going to say anything about the Africa Centre. Everybody in this room knows more about it than I do. But I hope the things I'll say may give some strands, may prompt some thinking. My experience covers theatre, heritage, education, services for disabled young and disadvantaged young people, and most healthcare, and most recently transport policy. I was asked to highlight a handful, 4 or 5 important issues which I think arise again and again in organisations. And if you're intending to go down the route of rethinking the governance and the relationships in the organisation, there's some of the issues which I think you'll probably need to tackle. Governance is one of those really awkward words. I don't really know what it means. The best definition I've come across actually started off talking about corporate governance in the commercial sector, but it seems to capture a couple of important notes. It defines governance as how an organisation operates in terms of the systems and procedures and protocols it has that are meant to ensure accountability and sound ethics. So it talks about some of the things that are done. It talks about outcomes in terms of ethics and accountability. Enron won numerous prizes for the quality of its governance. Many prizes. They were the first in show, best in show. Reality was there were some malevolent people in that organisation who said things, signed up to things, but were doing totally different things. They went to jail. Their audit company, Arthur Andersen, went out of business with a loss of 85,000 jobs. That was one that got seriously wrong. So it's really important to focus on what actually happens rather than what people say. I think that's a very rushed deal. I hope it's
Thank you. I think just to say that two things as we move forward. One is that this is a very constructive meeting, and we're engaging with the Africa Centre to chart a way forward. I think we can disagree in this meeting, but I hope that we can not become disagreeable as we exchange ideas. The second thing is that we want to really look at three issues as we move forward, which are very important, and I think everybody here is concerned about. The one is, they're all linked, but I've separated them out. The first is the vision, as Eric was talking about, which will impact on the programming. I think we'll be discussing that after the break in a lot more detail. The other two issues are the building, and then finally this issue of the governance. SNAC obviously, let's say the Africa Campaign obviously has a position on all of those three different issues, and I'm sure the Africa Centre and the board have their own position. And I think what we're trying to see tonight is whether we can move forward and work constructively together, because we're all concerned about saving the Africa Centre in all our different ways. So just to bring everybody in the audience up to date on what's been happening within STAC, and then Kay will bring us up to date on what's been happening at the Africa Centre. Dele will take us forward.